Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring free will, materialism, and precognition. My guest is Dr. Vernon Neppe, neuropsychiatrist, director of the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute in Seattle. He is also the author of Reality Begins with Consciousness, a book that he wrote with physicist Edward Close, which develops a new model for thinking about integrating consciousness and science using a multi-dimensional, nine-dimensional theory of reality. Welcome, Vernon.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. As you point out in your article on the topic of free will, the hardcore materialists would say there's no possibility of free will, that the universe is based on determinism. And ironically, people who study precognition in parapsychology come to a very similar conclusion, saying that, if the future can be forecast, then there's no room for free will.
That is true. Mm-hmm. And so those are two opposing views to the view I will express today.
Yeah.
And the view I will express today is, as you pointed out, we developed a model called triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm, or
That's a mouthful.
It is. Mm-hmm. So therefore I call it TDVP.
Uh-huh.
And as you again point out, it's based on higher dimensional components. And in this instance, one aspect that we discovered that we're dealing with a nine-dimensional quantized finite reality, mm-hmm. Triads involving space, time, and an equivalent consciousness component, mm-hmm. and all three are in union together, tethered together, triadic, dimensional. We make distinctions, and we talk about vortices, and this is a new paradigm. Mm-hmm. But I'm mentioning this in this context because this whole area that Dr. Edward Close and I pioneered, which we call dimensional biopsychophysics, which to me is more important in general mm-hmm. than this component of saying neuropsychiatrist, behavioral neurologist, psychopharmacologist. Those are just different hats I
wear. So would I call you a dimensional biopsychophysicist?
Yeah, that would be the correct term. And there are only two or three around in the world, mm-hmm. because it's an area that we introduced. Mm-hmm. But the reason why I'm telling you this now is because it's enormously important in this discussion of free will.
In other words, if our viewers can grasp dimensional biopsychophysics, they might be able to resolve some of these paradoxes regarding materialism, precognition, and free will.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So let's just very broadly see what part of the problem is.
Okay.
We know we grew up with sometimes a great behaviorist component. You have genetics, yes. Some of the behaviorists are quite prepared to accept that we are genetically different, mm-hmm. and a lot of the data has shown mm-hmm. that we all have unique DNA in this regard.
Yes.
Can't do anything about the DNA, so you have your genetics. You're born into an environment, and your environment teaches you certain things, you learn certain things, you become conditioned, you will respond in a particular way, so you have a stimulus and a response. And then there are these arbitrary events that occur in one's lifetime. Mm-hmm. One's house burns down, one's parents become divorced, or whatever. And that is the traumata that happen. Mm-hmm. And all of those lead to this event occurred, this is my mm-hmm. decision I'm making. It's not free will. It's got nothing to do with
Everything is caused by antecedents.
So there's a cause, and that's an effect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And that would be the classical materialistic paradigm. No problem. We have no free will. I start saying to myself, wow, if we don't have any free will, what's the purpose of life?
Yeah.
What's the meaning? As there's no purpose, we are just robotic individuals. We're born, we have these experiences that we cannot really change. We're exposed to random events as well. And then we die.
But you know, the average person doesn't think that way. It's typically a certain group of scientists and academics who would argue there's no free will. The average person surely believes that they make decisions.
Yeah, and they like to think that they make decisions, but maybe they don't because they're just conditioned that way.
Yeah.
I don't like that idea that you've mentioned about the scientists. And certainly the average person does realize, wait a minute, I'm deciding something. And so we're going to work here with a model of restricted free will in people. So let's go to the second option.
Yeah.
You mentioned that second option. And some of the consciousness researchers have said, hold on, there's a vast amount of data for so-called scientific foreknowledge or precognition. In fact, when you start looking at the data that exists, we're not dealing with a small amount of data where it's a maybe. All right, there are different methodologies, but from a very good methodological point of view, we know that chances of precognition being wrong are something like more than 1 in a billion to 1 chance.
You mean less than?
It's less. Well, being wrong is more. Is so in that context. Yes, the chances are less than in that context. The point about it is, statistically, we are dealing with precognition, which we could say, using scientific data and good, legitimate scientific data, is a fact.
In other words, the evidence for precognition, statistically speaking, is overwhelming.
Exactly. And moreover, there's something similar to precognition. Some would even say it's a subset of precognition called presentiment.
Yes.
And the evidence for presentiment is also less than the 1 in a billion against chance.
And the presentiment research, for viewers who may not know, deals with physiological measurements. A person is provided with a startling negative stimulus, for example, but the body will respond to it. Even though the stimulus is presented in random order, the body anticipates when that will happen, and you can measure that physiologically.
Yes. And so now if you start looking at this and you say that, hold on, that materialist paradigm is, as I see it, ridiculous and doesn't take into account all the facts.
No.
What about these good researchers who've done work on precognition and presentiment? And if you can predict the future, whether it is a future physiologically and a future just a few seconds later, or whether you can predict a future that is way, way into the future, or a day later, or whatever, under those circumstances, how can one have free will?
Right. Right.
So
that
now we
raises a very profound question.
We have this strange situation of, can you have free will and precognition, and can both exist at the same time?
Yes, and of course we still need to take into account all of those levels of causality that the materialists point to, because they are also quite real.
Of course. So, you have your genetics, your environment, your conditioning, your reflex responses, your stochastic events that might occur. In other words, the events that just might happen to be occurring at random, but happen to be affecting one's responses at that level, and the fact that not only is one dealing with contemporaneous phenomena that are occurring at that moment in time, but one is dealing with precognitive phenomena, foreknowledge, and maybe even with some researchers, retrocognitive phenomena, back knowledge, and you take into account all of that, and what is left? Well, surely you can't have free will.
It would seem not, and yet, as we pointed out earlier, everybody's intuitive experience is that they do have free will.
Yes.
And it would seem easy to demonstrate. I can say to you, in 2 seconds, I will raise my hand. And then I do.
The only trouble is, of course, you're raising your hand not because of that, because you've been conditioned to talk about it and then raise your hand in a certain kind of way. You can always go backwards.
Yeah.
But it is the beginning of an example of I'm making a choice.
Yes.
And so what I'm trying to get across here is another example. I will call it limited free will, that we all have limited free will. And we'll even go into the fact that using this model, our subatomic particles, our electrons and our protons and our neutrons and our atoms in a certain kind of way have some kind of free will. And I'm also going to use the example that at the infinite level, maybe a deity, maybe a divinity, that might be complete freedom of choice. But you can see the problem. The problem is simply this. If I'm going from the past to the present to the future along one dimensional line, a linear kind of time, how do we explain that precognition? How do we explain maybe even retrocognition? And how do we explain free will?
People these days in physics are very interested in the topic termed backward causality, that influences, causal relationships can come to us from the future.
Yes. And so this is why I use the term retrocognition in terms of backward causality, backward knowledge, and it sounds ridiculous. But you've already seen that this is linear. It's one directional. People sometimes say, because I'm about to talk about multidimensional time, they say, oh, you've got 3 dimensions of time, the past, the present, the future. Of course, that's not 3 dimensions of time. It's 1 dimension in time. It's a linear line, and we just have one moment in that regard. And that backward causation sometimes is that linear time. And the forward causation, which we call in precognition, is that linear time.
So 3 dimensions of time would be the equivalent of moving up and down in time or sideways in time, as well as past, present, future.
Yes. Up and down and sideways might imply 2 dimensions. So we've got to get to 3 dimensions of time. But this is why I mentioned our TDVP model, because we begin with a 9-dimensional quantized finite model, and we postulate, we cannot prove, but mathematically there is some cogent evidence that there are 3 dimensions of space, 3 dimensions of time, and 3 dimensions of consciousness. And now suddenly we have a different ball game. But let me just get back to this precognition ball game.
Yes.
It's not a case of people knowing 100% of the time what will happen in terms of foreknowledge. If they can know, and you know this well because, as I recall, you ran a precognitions group.
Well, that's true.
And I have run a precognitions group, and I say to my group of so-called subjective paranormal experience, or, if you want, people who have shown themselves to be apparently very good in terms of psychic precognition, I say to them, if you can bat 300 like a baseball player, you're a superstar.
Absolutely.
You would join the Hall of Fame. In fact, if you batted 100, you probably would be a superstar. And sometimes they get upset. Because they get upset, I saw it. It happened. And yet it didn't happen. It's almost as if something has turned off before they've reached that. In other words, it might have happened in another dimension of time and consciousness, but not that.
Yes.
Now, my experience with this began at age 11. My sister decided she was so-called psychic and decided she would communicate with the so-called spirits using a Ouija board. And I remember well, here's this little boy who's already trying to be a scientist, rather frightened. I'm standing at the edge of the door and I'm watching. And my sister says a prayer that somehow these malevolent spirits will not arrive. And first question she says to this Ouija board is, when will I die? And it spells out, I won't tell you. And I'm busy recording all this data. The next thing she says is, whom will I marry? And it spells out a name. Now, I cannot at that point tell you whether or not she had met this person or not. But if she had, it was almost incidental. She was one of those who was very attractive, would have, if she wanted, a different date every night. And then she said, when will I get engaged? In other words, when will he propose to me? And it spelt out a date about, say, some 15 months in the future. And then she said, when will we get married? And it's a little more complex than this, but it spelt out another date. And here's the scientist busy recording all this information.
Yes.
Sure enough, she starts going out more seriously with this individual. Sure enough.
Could have been a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Of course it could be.
Yeah.
Sure enough, she then meets, or he proposes. We even relocate cities, and we're traveling from Durban to Johannesburg at the time on that very day. We didn't know that at the time. And an hour later, she comes along and says, Vernon, Vernon, I'm engaged. And I look at her and I say, but you knew that. Like, what's the big deal? And that was the exact date. And then they set up a date for their marriage. And it's the same date that the Ouija board has told
which you recorded and they probably forgot.
Which I've recorded, yes. Except they set up that, and they're going to get married on that particular date, except they find that the hall that they've booked is already booked and everything. And they decide to get married 3 days earlier on what turns out to have been my parents' wedding anniversary. And now I am perplexed. She's met this guy. He's proposed on the right date. The Ouija board said that particular date, that was the date they decided. And of course there could be some self-fulfilling component, and we're talking that whole materialist paradigm as well would still work. And suddenly the date is changed. And I'm saying, hold on. And I began to call this the Neppe law of cause and effect. At that moment in time, a particular cause occurred, and that produced a particular effect. But then the cause was changed. They couldn't do the right booking, and they changed the effect. And I kept thinking about this, and in fact, that was one of the first little papers that I wrote, although I didn't publish it at that point in time. Let's fast forward a quarter of a century later. I, one night, have a dream. And let's put into perspective, I was lecturing extensively around the country, to the extent that I once met a pilot on a plane who was going back home, and I discovered I had flown more than him that week. I never had any fears about any kinds of things pertaining to flights or travel. And I have this dream, and I know that I'm in Boston, And I know in this dream that I am due to lecture in Central Connecticut that following morning.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next night, I have that same dream. Now, I've never had repetitive dreams in my life. This time, I'm in Boston, and because I had to lecture early the following morning, I had to take a limo, and this was all arranged. And I know that we're going over a bridge. And the third night, I have this dream, and I'm going in this limo from Boston to Central Connecticut, and we're going over the bridge, except we're in a body of water.
Mm.
And the fourth night, same dream, except this time I know I've been killed.
Okay.
Well, rather frightening, but so what, this is part of my own psychopathology maybe, but I've never had anything like this before.
Or it could be a warning dream, which I think is how you took it.
Well, the fifth night, I have the same dream. And again, I know I've been killed in this body of water.
Yeah.
The sixth night, I would see my patients, and then I would do a red eye, which I was due to do to Boston. And I'm sitting on the plane, and I'm thinking, Vernon, you're utterly crazy. Here you are, your last night alive, and you're busy taking a red eye to Boston. And meanwhile, incidentally, I've told my wife this, because by that stage I'm a little concerned. But I know
I've got 6 dreams in a row.
Yeah, but I know I've got an audience overall in terms of my lectures of several thousand people I'm talking to.
Yes.
So I arrive in Boston, and I give my lecture that morning, and I give another lecture that afternoon. And at this point, I'm really feeling a lot of trepidation. I'm really feeling anxious. I'm really feeling distressed. But my lecture goes fine. And I'm busy thinking, how can I do this? So I phone up the limo company. What is your record? We've never had an accident. You have seat belts? Of course, sir, we have seat belts. What's the driver like, etc., etc.? It doesn't help me at all. I walk in that evening to give my lecture, and the hostess, whose company is busy paying for this whole thing, I say to her the following: I have just called the limo company, and I have cancelled my ride. And the limo company says, may I ask why? And I say, yes, I have a feeling. And the guy says to me, you don't need to worry because I don't have a feeling. And I said, I'm cancelling. He says, well, you'll be charged $180 anyway. I said, I couldn't care. I'm cancelling. I immediately phone another limo company and arrange a ride. And suddenly I have this complete peace. I phone my wife and I say to her, it's okay. I've changed the cause and I've changed the effect. And I walk in and I meet this hostess who is paying for it all. And I say, by the way, I've changed this limo. And she looks at me and she says, you had a feeling, didn't you? Now, I've never uttered one word to her. We've never met. I say, yes. She says, I understand. I also had a feeling. I was an airline stewardess, and I had this terrible feeling about a flight. And I phoned in sick, and that flight crashed. Almost everyone was killed. And I started saying to myself, Neppe law of cause and effect, it was almost like that experience at age 11 was there for me to learn from. And as you said, you can take it as a warning. Let me just throw in one more little extra there. It just so happened that the next day, in my lecturing, I happened to meet up with a psychoanalyst. And we're busy chatting. And this is fresh in my mind. I tell him the story. And he looks at me in amazement. And he says, you mean you didn't take that first limo? And I said, most certainly not. Would you? He says, of course I would have. How would I have been able to work through my anxiety unless I took it? And I said to him, maybe you would have been dead and not needing to work through your anxiety. And he shook his head and looked at me in amazement and got up and walked out.
But his perspective would be a standard one from a psychotherapeutic point of view. You need to work through those emotions, that it probably was the result of some unresolved childhood conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, in fact, I will just add, I've had 2 more instances of this Neppe law of cause and effect. And running these precognitions group, I've been able to see how maybe you have a tree and you have branches on the tree and you just turn off in terms of your branches and go in another direction. But those branches in the tree and the leaves that result can be important to you, but they're not reflecting that whole forest. That whole forest might be one of a divinity. That whole forest might be one of the broader laws of nature, and one is not necessarily impacting, but you have to be able to turn off.
Now, let's come back to your work on the multi-dimensions of time, and perhaps can you explain in layman's terms how precognition and free will can exist simultaneously because of these dimensions?
Yes, I'm getting to this because of this forest and because of the fact that we have our trees. You see, when we're having our events or our dreams, let's record my dreams, your dreams, everyone's dreams. And, of course, John Donne wrote a book in relation to this, but he didn't seem to realize his descriptions of time seriality. Very, very complex.
Yes.
I've read the book 3 times to try to fully conceptualize what he was trying to get across. And there were certain areas that he just was not focusing on with his experiment with time, which this simple Neppe law of cause and effect does.
Yes.
But this Neppe law of cause and effect fits right within this fabric of triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm. The first thing one's got to realize is one has multidimensional time. Time is volumetric. Now, we dream, you dream, everyone dreams. We plot it on a graph. Our conceptualization of time might be different, yours and mine during that dream, and it might be very different from clock time.
Dreams tend to be.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean to say that one is dealing with just one dimension, because our graph is a 2-dimensional plane. But let's imagine that I have my dream, and now I phoned that limo company and cancelled and got a new limo. Have I turned off? And if you graph this, you could talk about it orthogonally, which is a nice term for perpendicularly in multiple different dimensions, and we actually use the term perangular because this is dynamic. These 90-degree turns, Pythagorean terms, but in a 9-dimensional matrix.
Yes.
If you turn off, you suddenly are not only graphing those 2 dimensions, you're graphing a 3rd dimension. You've gone in a different way.
Yeah.
You have made a choice, and you've been able to actively make a choice that is different. You've changed the cause, you've changed the effect. Now, you would say, well, if this is so, the data on precognition should not be 100%. Of course it's not 100%. We both spoke about the fact that the data on precognition might be...
It's overwhelming, but it is statistical.
It's statistical, and it might be if the person got a 10% hit rate, it would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Why do they have the misses? Because here is our branch, here is our tree, and we're turning off at every point in a multidimensional time.
Well, it sounds as if what you're saying is that the whole universe has free will.
Yes. Has free will to a limited degree in the context of what can impact and what they can impact.
So it's a measure of free will and deterministic factors that represent the fabric of our life.
Yeah, and so one has extent. One has dimensional extent, which is a measurement, and that extent has time, But you can also apply your consciousness, and the time is within that, is embedded in that consciousness. And this is the fabric. But it's a limited free will because we can't impact everything. To a large degree, sometimes more and more, you can impact free will at a greater level. So we come along and we're doing these podcasts, these YouTubes. We're impacting maybe not 5 people, we're impacting potentially thousands of people.
Yes.
Or we appear on television and we just happen to be that famous quarterback in the Super Bowl. Well, how much impact can I have? Now, it's with the other team. I just do not want him to throw for a touchdown. How much impact can I really have? It's outside my forest. But for him, he changes his idea. Instead of throwing, he's going to run. And he is making certain choices. And it might be the coach that makes that choice. And so you have to look at things broadly. And sometimes that impact, that free will, is not just a biological one or psychological one. It can be linked up with, as we said at the beginning, that family experience, that cultural experience, that social thing. All of these throw in. But ultimately, at any point in time, one's choice is there. So this is humans.
In other words, we don't exercise our free will very often, but we have the potential to.
Yes, but I think that sometimes, if you look at it in a small kind of way, one is exercising one's free will all the time. But certainly that word potential.
Yeah.
But now let's throw in, what about my dog?
Your dog?
Yes. Does my dog have free will?
I would assume some.
Well, you know, the question
You've already said atoms have free will and particles have free will.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. So that's the assumption.
Yeah.
But that dog probably has a more restricted free will than us humans because he's learnt his behaviors. He has his reflexes. He has his events that are random in his life. He's got his genetics. He's got his environment. He likes his food.
Yep.
He makes choices in relation to that. But the choices are very much partly based on that materialistic fabric. But all the same, I'm going to go down and I'm going to argue that, yes, there is that limited free will. It might not be the branches. It might just be a tiny little bit of a leaf.
Yeah. But I would assume, to go in the other direction, that a spiritually awakened individual will exercise more free will than the average person.
I would hope so. And I would hope that this gives meaning and understanding in terms of even concepts like good and evil, which we will shortly discuss.
Yes.
It allows for the development of higher awareness, and certainly I think that they would have greater free will. But now, how can I make this ridiculous comment that atoms have free will? Well, you know, we've already had a chat about Gimel. And I've translated Gimel into a kind of consciousness. And that kind of consciousness that is linked up is what I used to say, that even at that quantal level, it's not just a quantum. It is, in reality begins with consciousness. In the first edition, before we had discovered Gimel as a massless, energyless third substance that was absolutely necessary for existence in reality, because otherwise it would not, the atom would not be stable. But when one looks at it in that context, I used to talk about the qualit, because already there I knew that consciousness had to, in some kind of way, be linked up with the atom.
Since you've described consciousness as tethered to space and time, it would suggest that even in a photon, this most subtle of particles, there's a measure of consciousness.
Yeah, and maybe that photon is in a certain kind of way, that consciousness.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, you now get to this subatomic level. And I started saying, if one extends everything from these subatomic particles, from, let us say, the quarks, the up and down quarks, the neutrons and the protons, and the electrons, and we put that together in terms of atoms, and we've spoken about photons, and we go higher and higher. At the end of it all, using any kind of paradigm, we are just this expression of mass energy Gimel or mass energy consciousness. We have to be able to extend this all the way through at that finite level, and we've spoken about the fact that the finite is embedded within the infinite, and the infinite impacts and can be influenced by the finite. And if you extend this, you start saying maybe there is a minuscule difference. Now we have some supporting data that maybe is a minuscule difference, which to me absolutely amazed me when we did the mathematics. The supporting data is this, that when you look at the two up quarks in the proton, which has also one down quark, there always are three, and there's good reason in our TDVP model, this triad. And when you look at the two down quarks in the neutron and the one up quark, you would think that the amount of Gimel in each of the up quarks would be the same, and in each of the down quarks would be the same. Guess what? They are not. They run through 1 to 6. There are 6 of those quarks, and each one of them have a different amount of Gimel. And I said to myself, this is bizarre. Could it be that in a way, given that Gimel is the expression, we think, of a union of consciousness with subatomic particles, these 6 different figures are clues that we are dealing with different qualities of consciousness in each one of these subatomic particles. It sounds bizarre, but then all of quantum physics sounds bizarre. And this is just one little throw-in where if we extend our triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm through to dimensional biopsychophysics, and you can see here, we're using dimensions, we're using bio, the biological, and the higher you go up in that biological scale, the more you develop, and the psychological, and as we've said, maybe the more developed the person, you can extend your choices, your freedom of choice more, and then of course there's the physics component. If we extend this and use this model of dimensional biopsychophysics, realize we have multidimensional time, probably 3-dimensional time, embedded within consciousness and embedded in terms of a meaningful kind of growth, suddenly you can understand we're not materialists. There's more than that model. There's more than just precognition and presentiment, which is sometimes right but sometimes wrong. You have your choice and your tree, and you're choosing each little leaf, one step at a time, and you can impact in terms of yourself and your immediate world at that bio, psycho, familiar, socio-cultural level, but let's throw in all sorts of other things in the most minimalistic way, astronomo, physico, chemico. In fact, there are 31 different combinations that we list in our book, Reality Begins with Consciousness, and I being looking at things statistically, it just so happens that makes up a nice long 300-letter word, and I've asked the Guinness Book of Records to include that as the longest word in the English language, and they haven't yet.
Can you pronounce it?
I cannot even say all 300 letters, but I certainly can talk about the most important one. Ethico-spiritual, bio-psycho-familiar, socio-cultural. There is an ethical component here, a spiritual component here, and biological, psychological, integrated within the family,
Yeah.
social and cultural elements. So all of this is pertinent.
Well, Vernon, if your model turns out to be accurate, we should be able to come up with a whole new science, a very precise understanding of the relationship to consciousness all the way down to the quark level.
2-dimensional biopsychophysics.
Thank you so much for being with me, Vernon. It's been an exciting discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.